Thank you, Augustus, for coming on the podcast and taking the time today. It's great to be able to connect. You are the founder and CEO of a company called Rainmaker. You guys are working on cloud seeding and weather modification. And for those who don't really know what any of that means, we'll get into it. But before we dive too deep, it would be great for those who have never, heard of you or your company, if they could just get your story from as early as you're willing to start to where you are today, and maybe you could talk about some of the decisions you made along the way.
Yeah, sure. So I think the good place to start is probably Berkeley physics. So I got into UC Berkeley, and at the time, the reason why I wanted to do that program was because I wanted to see whether I could contribute to the discourse on whether God existed via physics. I was an atheist at the time, and was studying physics at Cal. Loved it there. Great time, great program. And then when the pandemic hit, Berkeley was super locked down. I had some family in Texas, and so I moved to Texas. Was still doing school online there and became a personal trainer just because I like to work out and I didn't know anybody. And so while I was training folks, I met the biggest water well driller in Dallas, Fort Worth, so in like the DFW area. And he and I just became friends, started shooting the breeze about water infrastructure, groundwater, water policy, all this kind of stuff. And eventually he told me that in addition to the business of drilling, he was starting a business to handle all the regulatory compliance around groundwater use. And I was like, well, what does that mean? Why are there regulations around groundwater? What do they consist of? It turns out everywhere west of the Mississippi, with a few rare exceptions in, say, like Nebraska, the groundwater, the aquifers are so depleted that they're either empty and pumping sand, or they're going to be empty within the next like 30, 40, 50 years. And the consequence of that is going to be the collapse of American agriculture, the collapse of the Colorado River and the ecosystem and all the cities that are dependent on it, generally the depopulation of cities like Phoenix, Tucson, Las Vegas. That is a really terrifying outcome that not enough people are talking about or even aware of. The regulatory response to the impending collapse of water availability has been to reduce how much people are allowed to use water. So there's this new regulatory regime in Texas, California, et cetera, dictating how much water you're allowed to use, the reporting scheme of how often you have to say the amount of water that you're using to the state, and then the fees if you go over your budget. And so what he was thinking about starting was a consulting company to drive a truck out into the middle of a field, read an analog flow meter for a farmer, fill out a report manually, submit it to the government on their behalf. And we got to talking more. I was a Silicon Valley tech dude, and we kind of just said like, well, why don't we automate this process? And what that meant was taking an IoT flow meter, installing it on a farmer's well or an HOA's well or a factory's water well, and then writing a bunch of software to handle all the reporting. And so I worked on that for a while I was in school. Then my senior year, dropped out of college to pursue that company full time. Worked in water policy for and water infrastructure through this company for like 3 years. And towards the end of my time there, realized, no matter how much more efficiently and effectively we steward the water that we have, no matter how much more we reduce consumption, say with like drip irrigation, which is a more efficient agricultural irrigation method, or low flow toilets, or turning the faucet off when we're brushing our teeth, if we don't produce more water, we're hosed, right? Like we just simply have too much demand to meet without producing more water. And I like to live in Los Angeles. I like to see, the Western United States flourish. I want to keep living in Los Angeles. And that made me anxious about our water situation. So I looked into all these different technologies after selling that business in March last year. I looked into all these different technologies to produce more water. And obviously desalination is great, but the two problems with it are, one, you produce all of this toxic brine. That's the byproduct of desalination. And people haven't quite figured out what to do with that yet. So I didn't start a company in desal for that reason. But two, if there's no ocean near you, you're kind of hosed, right? So California is going to benefit a lot from desalination. And even the water that California gets from desal will offset the amount that it takes from, say, Nevada. But really, you need more water produced in the interior of the country because you can't pump all this desalinated water over the Sierra Nevada mountains. And so I was pretty desperately looking for an alternative way to produce water and found a couple interesting technologies, but ultimately found cloud seeding, right? Weather modification. And so cloud seeding, simply put, is just acknowledging that clouds are water. Certain clouds have enough water in them that they're not naturally precipitating. But if you emit certain aerosols into them, either via plane or in our case, a drone, you can freeze the small water droplets into the cloud, into big enough snowflakes such that they fall either as snow or melt back into rain. And so I heard about cloud seeding. I was super excited about it. I wanted it to be real, but if you look up cloud seeding, there's 70 years of skepticism and criticism of it as to whether it's real, as to whether it's effective. And before starting a company, I went to something called the Weather Modification Association conference. And so that was in Boulder, Colorado. It sounds like a bunch of guys in robes, performing rituals or something to control the weather. Actually, it's just a bunch of cracked academics that have been researching this stuff forever. And I found out that recently there was an innovation where we realized if you take really high resolution radar and you scan in the path of the plane that's seeding, if it's working, what you should see is an increase in reflectivity on the radar. You should see precipitation on the radar that's co-located with your plane or with your drone. And so once I found out that that's what they hypothesized and that's what they saw in this huge project in Idaho, and they could measure exactly how much water they produced that was exclusively man-made, I realized that this was finally a commercializable technology, because you could tell your end user, your farm, your utility, your state government, hey, this is how much water we produced for you. This is the value of cloud seeding. And so I started Rainmaker in April of last year.
Great. Well, appreciate all the background, and it's a really interesting story. I think back to like how it all started for you. It sounds like in the gym doing personal training, and it's like I like to, when I talk to people a lot, like my story, like how I've sort of navigated career and life thus far has been like very non-linear, sort of you can't really get the next step from looking at the previous one type of thing. And I've said that it's all about like following my interests. And for you, it's like you sort of stumbled into this water rabbit hole by going and starting to be a personal trainer in Texas. And it's like you could have never been like in advance, hey, I'm gonna go do personal training because I got a feeling I'm going to meet like a really high powered dude, and then I'm going to be like obsessed with his industry and then go and start a company there, and that's going to be my life's work. But sure enough, like that's what happened. So it's a great example, I think, of just like doing what you want to do and like keeping your eyes open and your head up and ending up finding things that you're really interested in working on, basically.
Yeah, dude, I totally agree and resonate with that sentiment. Like, if you're trying to tyrannize yourself and whip yourself into whatever the typical career track is that you think you should be on, or somebody told you should be on, you're gonna have a bad time. I know a lot of guys that have ended up in investment banking, and some of them love it and some of them don't really love it. And it's in part just because every day they wake up and they have to whip themselves into shape to get to their desk. And I've been super blessed, and a lot of my friends here in El Segundo, they've been super blessed because we've followed that sort of creative impulse, that generative impulse that I think everybody has within them, and it definitely is conducive to like a better destiny, I think, if you follow whatever that neat little whispering voice is that your curiosity facilitates.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I was one of those guys who started in investment banking specifically, so I totally know it. But you mentioned you're in El Segundo. I understand that's where you guys are building the company, and you've been out there for some time. I guess Texas maybe before that, and Berkeley before that. How do you like compare and contrast these places, the pros and cons of each, and what's going on specifically in El Segundo? Like I know there's a lot of sort of hype about it. I moved to Miami about a year and a half ago, probably 2 years after some of the initial like COVID hype, because it's just hard to tell when you're, seeing stuff on the internet and hearing from a few people, you can't really piece together what it's actually like to be there until you go there. And at the time, my life circumstances just didn't really accommodate like moving to Miami. But a couple years went by, the hype kind of died down, which actually makes it like more appealing to me when it's like less hype and more, there's some longevity to it and people aren't talking about it as much. I felt like a bit too much of a follower if I moved right when the hype started on Twitter or whatever. But El Segundo seems to have a similar feel to maybe Miami a couple of years ago. So what's going on there, and how does it differ from these previous places you've lived?
Yeah. The thing that I tell everybody is El Segundo feels too hard tech and too deep tech, the way that I imagine Milan and Florence felt during the Renaissance, right? Like there are more people here. There's a higher concentration of folks working on the most insane futuristic technology that I've ever heard of than anywhere else in the country, perhaps anywhere else in the world. Like this one 5 square mile city, and then really even this like 2 square mile neighborhood, all walking distance. It's warehouse after warehouse of people doing nuclear energy, of people building missile systems, of people doing weather modification, of people doing advanced manufacturing. And just that unto itself, like that level of futuristic technical competence is exhilarating to be around. And then even more than that, like everybody's having a really great time and fun time building all of it, right? Like it's not a series of academic laboratories that people are slaving away for 10 years in to publish papers. Like we'll all hang out, we'll all live together, we'll all have bonfires together, interspersed between the sessions where we're building whatever crazy technology we have. So that's been blessed. I mean, the talent concentration, the quality of people, the obsession of the people, like the zeal that they have for their industry and for seeing like a more prosperous future for America and the world, that is incomparable to anywhere that I've lived before. And I love Texas. I love Berkeley. I think you can make the most of any city that you're in if you're really intentional about it. Berkeley, though, it's mostly like AI conversations that are being had, which are interesting and worth having, but there's not a lot of diversity in industry, AI and software for the most part, a little bit of biotech stuff. And the amount of different sort of intellectual stimulation we get here from the different industries, and also just the deeper conversations about, you know, the nature of the world. That's super satisfying. Texas was great, way slower paced. Even Austin, I think, is a little bit slower paced than anywhere in like a major coastal city. Miami feels fast paced, right? So does LA, so does El Segundo.
Yeah, no, that's a good overview, and I definitely would like to come out and visit and check it out. I've been to LA a few times in the last year or so, but I haven't made it down to El Segundo yet. But speaking on sort of geographical points, as I try to segue this relatively smoothly, you mentioned how, 30 to 80 years from now, uh, states like Arizona, cities like Salt Lake City and Vegas could be in a lot of trouble given the way that water scarcity is trending. And this is something that, like, as I was listening to you talk on other podcasts, like this was kind of like a foreign thing to me. Like I know roughly that there are like water issues. I know like in California, you're not supposed to shower for some length of time or whatever. I know that like we've got like the forest fires issues. I don't know if that's related to all this. But what I hear more about is like when it comes to coastal real estate, for example. No one wants to buy, like I'm, being in Miami or whatever. It's like people are scared of coastal real estate because it's like, oh, climate change and sea levels are rising and oh, so and so city's going to be underwater in, X number of years. So that seems like a pretty popular concern, whereas this other one seems to be much nearer term and more predictable, I guess, than what's going to go on necessarily like with the climate at like a broader level than like a specific geography's water. So maybe you could speak to that a little bit, and I'm just kind of curious if it gives you a perspective on, well, with everything that you're doing, if you have sort of a perspective on certain areas from like a real estate perspective that are kind of interesting to you, or on the contrary to that, others that are like you wouldn't touch, with a 5 foot pole because it's just like even if you do a great job of cloud seeding, it's like they're in a pretty tough situation.
Yeah, it's very interesting because, for example, Phoenix, Arizona, they had one neighborhood that they shut down water, that they stopped sending water to. The municipal water utility stopped sending water to this housing development because they just didn't have enough to go around. So after people had built these houses, bought these houses, some of them had moved in, they turned off the water supply, which is crazy. And that's something that rightfully has made a lot of people anxious, right? Like if they're turning off water to developed housing units, right? They're not just banning new construction, but they're shutting off water to existing construction. How is that city going to grow in the next decade? That being said, I think that the climate crisis and any problems that humanity encounters are things we can engineer our way out of. And it's going to take a lot of elbow grease and a lot of ingenuity and a lot of capital, but it's entirely possible to solve these problems, right? And I don't think that with respect to water, cloud seeding is the only vector that we should be using to solve this, right? Like I'm very pro desal, I'm very pro efficient irrigation and things like this, but cloud seeding absolutely is going to be a means for us to augment and improve our water supply so that cities like Phoenix and Salt Lake and Tucson can keep on growing, or at least maintain the same standard of life, the same quality of life that they've had historically. So like Salt Lake, the Salt Lake is drying up. More and more silt is getting kicked up into the air because the lake bed's drying. It's giving people respiratory issues. It looks like looming ecological collapse. It's something that they need to think really long and hard about. And that state is because they have a huge cloud seeding program, at least relative to most other American states. Not as robust as it ought to be yet, but they're thinking about cloud seeding, and they've deployed cloud seeding for the sake of increasing water supplies in the Salt Lake. And so I would tie this all up and say, historically, the conversation around climate has consisted of mitigation efforts, right? Like, okay, we're emitting all of this carbon. Here's the trajectory that the planet's on because of that. What can we do to reduce emissions? What can we do to reduce the ways in which we're polluting and harming the planet? That's good. But what else we need is adaptation, right? And so what that means is, we already have, via pollutants, via carbon, done this amount of damage to the planet via deforestation, say. How can we now engineer solutions to adapt to the consequences of our previous work? How can we adapt to even naturally changing aspects of the climate? And cloud seeding is one of these adaptation measures that we can take to make water more available in places where it is either no longer or it will not be in the future. So I'm never going to leave Los Angeles. This is a place that I've planted my flag. I don't think it's a city without problems. But California, it's the Golden State, right? Like, it's the place where people in the 1840s came to try to become millionaires from panning for gold. And it's where Silicon Valley is, and it's where all the primes are. It's where Hollywood is. Like, this west of west, this edge of the world, this edge of the United States is a truly blessed and beautiful place. And I'm not worried about buying beachfront real estate someday, if I'm lucky enough, in Los Angeles, just because I believe that human ingenuity can solve all the problems that we're encountering in the next 100 years.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's an optimistic view, and I tend to share it. I think your point on, focusing a little bit less on mitigation and like prevention and more so on adaptation, like you said, or, repairing things. Those are better approaches that are just, I'm not very sympathetic to the view of like, let's stop growing, humanity and pushing forward technology stuff. Like, obviously there's this big, EAC versus like effective altruist sort of debate. And I try to stay out of that because it's like pretty, I don't know. I'm definitely much more sort of sympathetic to the EAC point of view, but it's like very tribal and it becomes like just full steam ahead at all costs. And I'm like, well, like maybe, there might be some risks worth like going a little slower on or whatever. I think like in a lot of these tribal battles, there tends to be like the right answer or like a reasonable answer somewhere in between. But regardless of all that, the thing, you said you planted your flag in LA. I love, California. Like I lived in SF for a bit. I've spent a decent amount of time in LA. And like you said, it's just a beautiful state naturally. But the thing that is sort of like has been in recent years, at least, like more of kind of a turnoff for me is just the policy of it. Like, we have a country with a number of states. Each state gets a certain level of sovereignty for policy and laws and regulation, taxes, whatever else. Is that at all like concerning to you? And I guess with context for that being that you're in a space that is very like policy driven, I imagine, and like regulation dependent in a way where the battles may be as much so on the regulation and policy front as on the technological innovation front. So how do you think about that from like, how's California on this stuff in like your particular domain? And then how are those battles going like elsewhere in the country where I understand it's just like not as friendly to cloud seeding and maybe similar technologies as one would hope and as we've seen in maybe other countries?
Yeah, I would first say, like, there's a lot of policy that people get very tribal. People often like to say, like, well, it's Texas versus California, for example, right? Or like Florida versus California. And I'm an American. Like, I love all of this country, and I'm super grateful that California has invested in so much of like the futuristic infrastructure that it has. I wish that the high-speed rail stuff was done faster, for example. Florida's definitely done a better job on that. But like I'm an American, I love both of these states. And something interesting about cloud seeding is it goes on and is supported in Texas and California. And these states are superficially, at least, as different as they could be. But water is a totally bipartisan issue. It's a non-tribal issue. Like I don't care if you're a Republican or if you're a Democrat. I don't care if you're American or from abroad. If you're interested in like a better future, a more productive future, one where the environment and humanity symbiotically flourish, like we're on side. I want to work with you and I want to work together. And so that's sort of my overarching thinking on like the tribalism around a lot of industry and politics in the US. With respect to regulation in California, um, if there are regulatory problems, like it boils down to a skill issue on my part, right? I am really excited to see this technology come to fruition in the United States. If it is banned in certain states or if it's hard to deploy in certain states, I would love to meet any policymakers and any legislators and stakeholders that are interested and willing to talk about this. California has been super receptive. Tennessee a little bit less so, but we can talk about that in a second. Like not everybody knows about cloud seeding. Not everybody knows about frontier nuclear energy. Not everybody knows about advanced manufacturing. Like it's the job of a founder to evangelize on behalf of their technology, to demonstrate the benefits of their technology and the value that they produce through it so that people do get buy-in, because like 99.9% of people want the best for their state, for their constituents, for the nation. And so the notion that like, big government's trying to squash small business. Like, yeah, maybe sometimes, but more often than not, um, folks just don't know about what the benefits of certain tech or certain businesses are. And so I love meeting with all the regulators in California, in Utah, in Texas, even in Tennessee, to help talk about how cloud seeding can benefit their state and their constituents. And so with respect to Tennessee, interestingly enough, cloud seeding water, it's not like a Republican versus Democrat issue. It's like, have you heard of cloud seeding or have you not? If you've heard of cloud seeding, if you're someone in Idaho or New Mexico or California or Texas, you're generally in favor of it because it's supporting your state's water supply. If you're in one of these water-rich states, say like the Great Lakes or Tennessee actually is experiencing like a historic drought right now, so they could use more water via cloud seeding too, perhaps. But because they've historically had plenty and it's been a non-issue, they haven't deployed lots of cloud seeding. And so when I went there, all of the legislators that I spoke to in the House, in the Tennessee General Assembly, super receptive, super forward-thinking, very thoughtful. In my testimony, there were a couple questions that maybe were less forward-thinking from the legislators, but a lot of people want to see this technology deployed there. It was just a matter of me getting there too late after all of this angst had been spun up about chemtrails, right? And what I'll say first is like, are there toxic metal additives in jet fuel? Yes. Are the things that you see in the sky, like the big plumes, the big trailing clouds at high altitudes in the tracks of planes, are those poisoning everybody and everything? Probably not. The amount of, say, like lithium or other metals in these jet fuels, astonishingly diffuse. I'm totally open to having a conversation about it. I think that people should be skeptical and inquisitive about like their government's activities and industry's activity. But like one, the contrails probably aren't as dangerous as we make them out to be. And two, contrails and chemtrails are altogether different than cloud seeding, right? Cloud seeding is something that is local in its effects. You can do it over an individual farm. You can stop whenever you want, meaning like its effects occur over the course of minutes and all of the material precipitates out. The effects are totally healthy, and we have 78 years of data on how negligible the environmental impact is from silver iodide and other compounds. And so I'll be back in Tennessee for their next legislative session to try and help get the best American technology we can to all of the farmers and hydroelectric utilities in the state.
Do you know where this concern with like chemtrails started? And maybe I missed it, but like what exactly are those? Like why are people worried about them? And then why are they being associated with cloud seeding if that's not really, if they're sort of separate issues seemingly?
Totally. Well, so the root of a lot of this comes down to the fact that like the government, the DoD, has conducted programs in the past that have been harmful to American citizens, right? Like inadvertently, generally inadvertently. Like we have deployed different chemical weapons for testing, say at like Plum Island in Long Island Sound in New
Mm-hmm.
York. And so there's this general awareness and wariness of whatever sort of obscure tech testing the government conducts. That has catalyzed a lot of angst about chemtrails. But then specifically, we have more airlines flying now than we ever have before. And because of that, the skies now have more contrails, condensation trails from the water that's emitted from jet planes, their engines as they fly. And what happens is these planes, their engines, they emit water that condensates and freezes at really high altitudes. And so you get these long strings of clouds, really high altitudes. People have paired the observation that there are more of these man-made clouds from planes in the sky and general angst about the government and its programs. They've paired those together, and then have become wary about the notion that these contrails are full of poisonous chemicals. And again, like I'm open to having a conversation about that and being presented more evidence about chemtrails. I try to be as open-minded as I can about any of these issues. But so far, I'm not compelled on the reality of those harming people. That is what like the chemtrail discourse generally consists of. Then on the flip side, like why is this compared to cloud seeding? Just superficially,
Right.
um, minerals and some sort of engineered intentional modification of the environment, specifically of the atmosphere, via chemtrails or via cloud seeding, those two things seem similar, right? Like there's
Right.
not too many people, there's not too many technologies talking about modifying the atmosphere. Cloud seeding does at a super local, at a super small temporal scale. But because of that similarity, people have paired them together and they don't yet know, or at least in many cases, they don't yet know about cloud seeding. And that's why they're anxious about it.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I mean, it doesn't make sense, but it makes sense why it's happening despite not making sense. And
Yeah.
it seems to be kind of like a theme in some of these, new and pretty important technologies with like, I mean, the other one that comes to mind is like nu nuclear power. There's not really good, I mean, I'm not like an expert on it or anything, but as far as I can understand, there's not great counters, and the most impactful counters are the counters that have most contributed towards not moving forward faster with nuclear energy have been basically something along the lines of like, you know, it's nuclear, so it's scary. Like we have nuclear bombs, that's scary. There's Chernobyl, that happened, so we can't do it anymore. And it's like people just make a huge leap when there's something that's like really big and scary, even if the thing that they're relating it to, that relation doesn't actually hold any water. So it seems like kind of a similar thing that's going on here.
Yep, totally agree. And again, that comes even if like the concerns that people have aren't grounded in like the science, say, or like the practical reality of the engineering. The onus is still on founders and is still on technologists to communicate how safe their tech is and what the benefits are. So, with respect to nuclear, there's actually something funny I'll say just because I'm super pro nuclear. I think it is one of the most important technologies that civilization has now and into the future. Very few people know this. The deer and wolves in the vicinity of Chernobyl, they're like largely immune to cancer now. Because the super low dose exposure of radiation has adapted them over time to becoming much more resistant to it. So, if anything, the radiation was actually good for them. That's kind of a
The,
tongue-in-cheek joke, but kind of real also.
the radiation vaccination for the deer and the wolves. So I'm not
Something like
necessarily gonna throw humans into the experiment on purpose, but it's at least hopeful. And I think people who dismiss it as like a for sure bad thing, it's I don't know. The more I've learned about it, the more pro-nuclear I've been, and this has been for a couple of years now. And it seems like the tides are turning in terms of like popular opinion a decent amount. I don't know if that's gonna be enough to sort of like get us going in the right direction in a pretty serious way, but we'll see. And hopefully that's the case. But You mentioned earlier, there's a few different approaches here, and you're like pretty in favor of all of them when it comes to, solving water scarcity and things like this. The first, I had to like sort of rewind when I was first listening to you talk about this on another podcast. You're calling it desal, which is short for like desalination. And I actually thought you were saying decel, which is like sort of a pretty good shorthand actually for like the other approach of, not showering for X amount of time and not, planting, doing almonds and pistachios and whatever. Like
Yep.
you basically putting a, chokehold on civilization's growth. So there's like desal, there's decel, and it's kind of a nightmare pronouncing both of those. There's cloud seeding, which is what you're doing. Is there anything before we discuss cloud seeding, like in a little more depth? Is there anything outside of those three that's like really worthwhile addressing, or does that pretty much cover it for like the main camps?
I think the last thing is probably alternative groundwater supplies. I think that's the one other really scalable water production technology. So there's a lot of aquifers that are either too deep and inaccessible, or they're part of these really porous rock formations that if you apply more advanced mining technology to, you could access that currently we don't access. And then there's a lot of brackish groundwater too. Brackish meaning salty. It's historically been too salty to irrigate with, right? Like you don't want to put salt on your plants. But a lot of it is less salty than the ocean. And
Mm.
because it's right under your feet in, say, Nevada, if you tap into that, then you can produce more water locally. You don't produce as much brine. That vector of increasing water supply is definitely one worth considering as well.
Interesting. So the first thing you're talking about is that fresh water,
Is
the
is
aquifers.
Yeah, so there's some freshwater aquifers that we've
Okay,
never.
and then the rest are brackish.
Yep.
Okay. Got it. So yeah, the brackish, both, I mean, the aquifer, obviously, if you can make use of it, makes a lot of sense. Seems like a low-hanging fruit. And then the brackish, despite the fact that you still need to go the desalination route, at least it's geographically local. And it
Yep.
sounds like the desalination is like it's a it's not the same magnitude as the ocean, so it's like both easier desalination and closer approximately like geographically. So maybe just like on the spectrum of difficulty or reasonability for desalination and cost, of course, it's just more reasonable. So that's an
Totally.
interesting
But then the
fourth
question is,
leg.
how do you fill up the aquifers with precipitation, right? So you need to make it rain more to keep the supply of water in the aquifer. And so cloud seeding is one of the ways that you can make sure aquifers stay full.
Yeah, and it's a fantastic name for the company, by the way, Rainmaker, and just the ability to say we're making it rain and everything. It's like that's almost a mission worth going after just for being able to say that that's what you do for a living alone. So I love it. So cloud seeding, I don't want to go too deep into it. Hopefully, cover some new content because I know you've talked about it a bit on other podcasts, which I'd encourage people to go check out for more of a deep dive. But to sort of summarize what I've understood about it. There's sort of three main types. There's what's called glaciogenic or glaciogenic, something like that, hydroscopic and electrostatic. And glaciogenic is the one that you guys are using. I think it's the most validated and the most sort of proven to be commercializable technology. And it involves basically taking water that's existing in these clouds and freezing it to the point where it'll, come down from the sky. Then hydroscopic is more about like consolidation as opposed to freezing, where it's like bringing the water together as opposed to freezing it as another means to get it to be heavy enough to come out of the sky. And then electrostatic is like somehow expanding the water itself. I'm less clear on sort of how that one works, but seems like just a sort of a third approach at this cloud seeding. So can you talk maybe a little bit about like why you guys have started with the first one, and do you have ambitions of getting at one of these other two approaches for one reason or another, or are you happy to stay in the glaciogenic camp for a long time?
I mean, I'll say for openers, great background research. Most interviewers do not know the difference or even bother to look. So that was solid. Um, so yeah, glaciogenic involves freezing the water in clouds into large enough snowflakes so that they fall either as snowflakes or rain. Hygroscopic, it's condensing the water droplets into bigger ones so that they fall. Electrostatic is actually similar to hygroscopic in that if you charge the particles a certain way, they'll collide with each other more often, grow into larger water
Hmm.
droplets, and fall. Um, I am totally like my interest is solving water scarcity. My interest is in producing enough water that our agriculture, our almond farms, our ecosystems, the Colorado River and our cities can flourish. Like I want to produce enough water for all three of those ends. If any of these technologies prove to be better than the other, be it electrostatic, hygroscopic, or glaciogenic, I'm totally agnostic to those and want to use whatever tech is best. That being said, glaciogenic has far and away the most demonstrable proof and validation academically. And so the reason why that is I mentioned before how you use radar to prove that cloud seeding is working. So when you're flying, in our case, our drone through a cloud, and we're scanning with radar, you should see on the radar in a seedable cloud liquid water, right? Then as you fly through and you seed the cloud, that water, that liquid water, changes phase. It freezes into ice. And so you can prove that what you're doing is working because you can measure that phase change from liquid to solid ice. And then you can track the precipitation down. That makes it way easier to communicate the value add to consumers and to prove even to yourself that what you're doing is worthwhile. For that reason, we're going to keep doing glaciogenic seeding because we haven't seen that level of radar-based or lidar-based validation from the other two technologies. Although, I think that in a future where Rainmaker scaled, we've really matured glaciogenic seeding with UAVs in different contexts, right? In like really, really warm areas, say in a lot of Nevada or down in Mexico or in like the Sahara. There's more opportunities to do hygroscopic or electrostatic seeding. And so at some point in the future, I would hope to develop that as well. But let's start with what we know can benefit consumers now rather than like an R&D project that we have to prove out.
Right, that makes sense. And for those who weren't familiar with cloud seeding, probably most people listening, I realized we might have jumped forward just a little bit, just that the fundamental way that cloud seeding works is basically because you're talking about, going and seeding these clouds, and I'm thinking like, well, people might not really understand what that is. It's complicated, but from a very simplistic view, it's a drone flying up and seeding. And by seeding, we were talking about like basically dropping some chemical into the cloud and not dangerous chemicals. But I think it's silver iodide or something like that. And that's what's causing these, three different types of reactions potentially that we talked about earlier, the freezing, the condensing, or the charging. So not as complicated as it might sound, and not some fancy thing. Cloud seeding, just kind of a drone and a chemical. So further to what you were saying, I'm thinking about, I understood that sort of measuring the impact is actually a super important thing for making this a commercializable technology where it's existed for a long time, but it was very difficult to say what impact it was having with, a confidence enough to compel someone to go and, pay for it or whatever. And what you've described is basically this ability to bottoms up measure that impact. And by bottoms up, I mean basically like you're looking at the actual cloud and like measuring the, liquid versus the solid or whatever it was. And that's sort of like one way to go about it. I'm wondering like if there's also a top down method that, you wouldn't expect to be necessarily as accurate, but is it even possible to basically go like are weather patterns and stuff and rainfall amounts and things like consistent enough across geographies where not to say that they're the same, but could you say like, hey, look, we did cloud seeding in this area of Nevada and we did not do cloud seeding or we did cloud seeding in like these 5 areas between Nevada and Arizona and California, and we did not do cloud seeding in these 150 areas across these same states. And this is like how much these places that we seeded varied from previous years' rainfall or their average rainfall of so many previous years. And this is like what the average was across all these other areas. Like, wouldn't that be kind of enough you're not gonna be able to like, it's not as, again, it's not as like bottoms up and it's not as precise, but isn't that enough to show like within an order of magnitude or, even more precisely than that, but maybe not as precisely, sort of the that this is working well enough without having to go that other route, or are those complementary measurements? Is there any reason to sort of do something like that, basically?
So people do stuff like that right now for cloud seeding programs. So all of this radar-based and lidar-based measurement, right? We'll call that physical evaluations. And then all of the rain gauges on the ground or snow gauges on the ground, measuring how much precipitation you got in an area where you seeded versus didn't seed. That's called statistical evaluation. And it's good, and we can do that, and we do that, and we should do that. The problems with statistical evaluations like that, though, are one, you don't really ever have controlled experiments, right? Like every cloud is different, every valley is different. So even if you have two relatively similar looking clouds in Valley A and then 5 miles away in Valley B, and you get a difference in precipitation, the local geography, the aerosols locally, the temperature differences there, even like a small difference in the amount of liquid water in those clouds, you can get radically different outcomes. So if you want to do a statistical evaluation, I mean, just off the jump, it's going to be tough. But then to do it robustly, you need thousands or tens of thousands of instances of seeding to do a real statistically robust comp.
Mm.
Um, that means like we should, and like we're going to, and I hope to have like a database of tens of thousands of cloud seeding operations to do comps in the future. But then even if you do all that robustly, in the last 2 years in California, from the two atmospheric rivers, from like El Nino this year and all the atmospheric rivers last year, we got ahistoric precipitation, like 100-year records for the last 2 years. You get pretty wild variability. And cloud seeding right now, like it's a great technology. It's something that we should absolutely deploy, but we're not miracle workers, right? Like we can't make it rain out of nothing. Like there have to be clouds there and they have to be the right kind of clouds. And then a lot of the time, like it looks like a single digit percentage point increase in precipitation over the course of the year. And in some cases, double digit. And Rainmaker is going to do everything in our power to drive those yields up even further. But if you're talking about something as radically variable as the weather year to year, geography to geography, storm system to storm system, and you're doing 3%, 4%, 5%, even 10% increases in precipitation, sometimes it's hard to read that signal through the noise, which is
Right.
why it's really important that we have physical validation of all of our operations too.
I see. So the change is sort of marginal enough that, I mean, it's material enough that it's very important, but it's marginal enough that you can't really have a loosely accurate reading and still prove out the results. Like you need to be very precise. So that makes a lot of sense. Um, who are the first people, like who are your first customers? Like who's paying for this? Like, is it, a ski resort out in Colorado that wants more snow on the mountain for tourist season? Or I know you do a lot of work with like farmers. Because this is one of those things that this all sounds amazing. It's like, yeah, we want more water, we want less droughts, we want, to shower as long as we want and eat almonds. But who's going to pay for this? It's like there's a lot of things that are good for a lot of people that it's like doesn't, we're not all pooling together funds. It might have to be like a government funded thing if it's something like that. But do you actually have private customers in the early days? Is it a combination of both? How can people think about that?
Yeah, I think that like for example with space, with launch, SpaceX, um, they had a tough fight to get like the United States government, federal government as a customer. Um, I think that that is something that people can do, but I want to do everything in my power to increase the odds of this technology being deployed and the fastest baby steps of success and deployment that we can make, we're going to take. And so what that's looked like and what that's going to continue to look like for a while is selling to farms. So either farms that just don't have enough water at all, or farms that are paying exorbitant penalties for using more water than their state has allocated them. And so in our case, we have a cattle ranch, a lemon farm, a pistachio farm that we're seeding over. Those are the ones that I can talk about. They're in the Central Valley.
Let
And
me let me just ask real quick, the way that you are helping farmers who have this fee that they have to pay above a certain amount is by they have to use less of the water that they're using because they're getting more of it out of the sky.
exactly.
Okay,
Yeah, so we offset the penalties they have to pay because they don't have to pump as much groundwater or buy as much surface water since they're getting more precipitation.
got it.
Yeah, so we're selling to farms first. Um, Talking to some ski resorts, obviously more snow on the slopes, higher quality snow instead of just like the stuff that gets blown from their snowmaking machines. That's of interest to them as well. Uh, Long term though, right? If we make it rain more over one farm, that farm is part of a watershed, and that watershed is part of a state. And so the benefits don't accrue exclusively to that individual farm, even if that's where the rain falls, because the aquifers recharge, because runoff ends up in the streams that other people benefit from. So long term, like we're going to continue working with farms, and I love working with farms. I've gotten free lemons and free pistachios from the ones we work with. No free steak yet. Long term, though, like municipalities, water utilities, state governments, and the federal government, they all are interested, should be more interested in cloud seeding because it can benefit all of their constituents and all of their water infrastructure, right? Like the fact that China has the foresight, I think a really good heuristic for deep tech and for infrastructure investment in the United States is China investing in this? If yes, we should at least invest with parity to whatever they are because we have the treasury to do it. China has the foresight to have the Beijing Weather Modification Office to spend almost $500 million every year on the program to employ 38,000 people, the size of like a large town, just in that one office. The UAE has a national program. Thailand has a national program. The Philippines has a national program. Saudi has a national program. One thing that as an American, and again, like I love my country and I'm proud to have been born here, super grateful and lucky to have been born here. One thing that I'm a little bit embarrassed about is like nationally, we don't fund this research and we don't have any large scale programs. Some states like Utah and California are becoming a little bit more progressive about it. But what should happen in the future is it should become municipal, state, federal level programs rather than individual farms having to pay for this.
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. So you mentioned UAE among, other countries that are paying more attention here, along with China and others. We talked a little bit before getting started with the episode about you had a recent trip out to the UAE. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the context for that and what's going on over there, what you were working on.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that I'll say is I was wary when I was going to the UAE because they have a lot of media online, right? Very glitzy, glamorous, futuristic cities. A lot of the time, that sort of hype turns out to be like Potemkin towns. Like I was wondering if I was going to go there and I was going to see one, beautiful Burj Khalifa and then not much development otherwise. But I was astonished at how built out, futuristic, gorgeous the city, and the city is within the country where I was only in Dubai and Abu Dhabi. But that was exceptional. And I'm really impressed with what the country's been able to do out of like a desert wasteland. That said, they have one of the more sophisticated and larger cloud seeding operations in the world at a national level. Recently, so I think a week and a half ago now, there was flooding all throughout the country, particularly in Dubai. Now, that said, people were wondering, okay, like they have the biggest cloud seeding program in the world that we know about, bar China. There was exorbitant flooding here. They're cloud seeding all the time. Did cloud seeding cause all this flooding? The first part of the answer to that is that was so much precipitation. Like I wish that our technology was that good. As yet, it is not that good. Nobody has cloud seeding tech that's capable of dumping meters of water in 24 hours out of the sky. Like in order for that to have happened, you needed a natural storm event that was naturally going to precipitate. And part of the reason why we know there was going to be natural precipitation in the UAE was because it also rained in Oman, it also rained in Iran. So that huge cell was going to dump water regardless. Now that being said, they have a very aggressive seeding program. They take almost every opportunity they can to enhance precipitation because the state needs the water, the agriculture there needs the water, and they want to develop the tech. And so I think earlier in the week, just after the event had happened, there was some speculation and some talk from the national office about flights that they may have ran to seed to enhance the precipitation even further beyond what naturally occurred. But by later in the week, they definitively said they had not cloud seeded. So whether they did or didn't is up for debate. But given how aggressively they're deploying the technology, it seems as though it's more probable than not that there was some relationship towards what happened, even if it was going to dump a ton of rain naturally.
Right, I see. So basically, cloud seeding could have made the issue incrementally worse, as we talked about earlier, but it definitely wasn't the cause of the issue. Is it possible that there's like unknown ripple effects that could be initiated with cloud seeding? Like I wouldn't expect you to necessarily, you if you knew about those, you would be talking about those, but like if you knew why they happened or how they happened or whatever. But would you rule out the possibility that that could be happening in some way, pretty confidently, or is that sort of more of a question mark potentially?
So there's three different things to consider. The first, with respect to like unknown consequences, is um, like, are we polluting the environment? Is silver iodide toxic, right? Are any of the minerals that we use toxic? Silver iodide, what we use now, it's 10 times safer than aspirin. So little of it is used, like as much as you can fit on the tip of your finger, you can seed 10,000 acres with. It's so diffuse. In fact, about 2 parts per million of soil in the world is silver naturally. Um, After decades of seeding, you can detect an additional like 80 parts per trillion of silver iodide in the soil. So it's immeasurably low even after decades of operation. And has not shown to have any harmful effects to the environment, to agriculture, to freshwater bacteria or life, or to human life. So that's the first thing to consider. After decades of research, we've seen no negative side effects with respect to pollution. The second thing is, are you taking water from one place and dropping it in another? And the answer there is, given all of the data we have after about 80 years, no, definitively no. The reason why that is, let's take the continental US, for example. There's a cloud blowing in from California, bound to precipitate in Nevada. Say you seed it in California. Only 9% of the water that flows over the continental United States in the atmosphere, in clouds, in atmospheric rivers, precipitates. Only 9%. Another 50% is just water vapor. About 41% is condensed ice and condensed water, liquid water. So what cloud seeding does is it takes a little bit of that liquid water that wasn't naturally going to precipitate and induces that to precipitate. So you still have all of the water in the cloud later on. In fact, there's reason to believe that because some of the dynamics, this is more frontier, but because of some of the dynamics of seeding, after seeding, you may convect more water into the cloud, such that it precipitates more downstream. That's speculative. There's some data to support it from like the last 30, 40 years. But largely, the exhaustive body of evidence that we have shows, no, you're not taking water from anybody. So first question, are you polluting things? No. Second question is, are you unintentionally taking water from other people? No. Third question, like, what we know about the status quo is that we're barreling towards a situation where we don't have enough water for cities like Phoenix and Salt Lake and even Dallas to continue existing. We know that agriculture in the US is going to collapse. We know that all these species are endangered because of the Colorado River collapsing. That's a bad outcome, and we know we're going that way. Like, we know that the aquifers are going to run out, and then all of the American Midwest's agriculture is going to collapse. All of the people in the United States that enjoy the luxury of cheap food because of how much we produce here are going to get price hikes because there's not going to be as much food available because there's not as much water available. All the people around the world that we export food to that are dependent on subsidized agriculture in the United States, and agriculture that we're benefiting from and they're benefiting from because of our water, they're going to lose out on that. And it's going to be way more consequential for them, for people in Southeast Asia and for people in Africa, because they're just not going to have food. That's the outcome that we know we're heading towards. The alternative is cloud seeding, right? Cloud seeding, we have 80 years of data on its efficacy, on its safety. We can model it out pretty robustly. We can say what the first order, second order, third order effects of these operations are going to be. And I am entirely in favor of more research, right? Because it's fair to say, like, these are complicated systems. We should be researching them to understand better what the consequences are going to be long term. But within reason, with a large body of evidence proving that it's safe, effective, and beneficial, we can take a calculated risk and say, okay, here's everything that we know about it. These are the reasons why it's great and we should deploy it. Here are some things that we should be researching to make sure that it's still safe. Let's check our assumptions. But at the very least, in this calculated risk option, right, where we deploy cloud seeding, we have a chance at averting this impending calamity of water scarcity, agricultural, and ecological collapse. So if you have to choose between a known disaster and something that seems like a pretty good alternative with some risks that we should research and approach cautiously, I always choose the latter. And I think it's reasonable for people to choose the latter because I'd rather give it a shot, and a safe one at that, at making the world better than just letting it decay.
Right. No, that makes a ton of sense. And I think that's more speaking to, here's an existing problem, here's some potential problems. But when you just focus on actual like those are obviously the harder questions to answer. But when like internally you guys are at work and you guys are all on board with this, um, are you, and you're painting the picture of like this vision of the future that you guys are all working to make happen. What's like that positive vision of the future that's sort of the long-term aspiration for what you guys are doing at at Rainmaker, and we'll wrap it up there, I think, with the positive long view vision of the future.
We're making Earth habitable, right? Like we want a trillion people on the planet to live symbiotically and productively and happily with nature in the most biodiverse and flourishing condition that it possibly can, right? Like it's going to take a really long time, and it's not just going to be cloud seeding that's responsible for this, but ultimately the vision for Rainmaker is a garden planet, right? Like we want to turn Earth into the most spectacularly lush and beautiful home world that it can be. And we're going to start by helping agriculture and just averting some of the drought or mitigating some of the drought that we can. Long term, though, like we want to see a trillion people on Earth and have this be the home world from which like we have the productive, safe, healthy ecology necessary to deploy ourselves to Mars, to the moon, to Titan, to worlds beyond just Sol, right? I think that like going to space, I'm entirely in favor of it. I want to see all the new technology that we possibly can on this planet and elsewhere. Um, but like turning this planet into the very best one that it can be is something that I'm concerned with doing in this lifetime. And I would say anybody else that wants to work at Rainmaker, go to makerain.com, click on our jobs page, email us if you have the similar vision and desire to see a great future. And come visit El Segundo if you want to work on something really hard and really exciting.
Awesome. Well, it's an amazing vision of the future, and I'm optimistic on what you guys are working on. So appreciate you taking the time today, and pleasure talking with you.
Jake, pleasure, man. Later, brother.